I'm still Ed Sundby. I came to know Martin when I was a very young child. His kind personality, helpful nature drew many to him for their help in writing or just sit down and hear a story of the past. Martin was born in 1913. He lived a full life of hard work and adventures. In 1921, Martin and his family moved to Truex Township, which is east of Williston a ways. He was 8 years old. This was about the time he started to help his family with the chores, cattle and horses. In his younger years, Martin milked and fed cattle, cleaned the barn, and learned to harness a team of horses. Martin said that learning to work on the ranch taught him responsibility and self-control. In the early years in Truex Township, Martin spent his time driving horses, on machinery, in the fields, and gathering milk cows. Occasionally, he would get the task of wrangling horses and going to roundups and brandings. Among the ranching, he was also a very good horseman. He was training horses with him and his brothers. They trained horses for the public and were very well known for their horse teams. When a road south of Epping was being built, they used the horse teams provided by Martin's family to pull a machine called a mucker. I don't know how many of us been around when they were still mucking roads, but that's how they used to build a road. Martin was called to duty to drive a 12-horse team on one occasion. He admitted his arms were pretty tired by the end of the day. It wasn't all work for Martin. As hard as it was in them days, him and his brothers, they were into training horses and even doing trick riding. Martin's ability to have a horse do tricks impressed many people, including myself. Now, personally, when I started riding, Martin had a trick riding saddle because he did some trick riding. So he brought it to me and wanted me to try trick riding. Well, I could jump from one side to the other and back to the other side. So he said, well, that's pretty good. He says, can you do the death drag? I didn't know what the death drag was, but did I find out? Running around with your head about 2 inches off the ground, I thought, that's not for me. I'm going to stand up on them horses. It's a lot easier. So I started Roman riding. In the 30s, when things were tough, Martin's family, they pulled up and left North Dakota, but Martin stayed. He struggled through the hard times, many brutal winters, long seasons of drought. His determined nature and strong character along the deep love of ranching in North Dakota kept him going. Martin continued to ranch over the next 6 decades, handling hundreds of horses, 500 cows. He did leave the ranch occasionally. He served in the service. He was on the ski patrol. He told me, he said, we would ski into the enemy's place because they couldn't hear us coming. I thought that was kind of interesting. So, over the years, he helped other ranchers. Martin, he was a steward of the land and worked diligently to create hay and farm ground. He would build a feedlot wherever he moved, and a person would wonder how he could design such an engineering marvel without an engineering degree. Martin even helped Clarence Parker, if many of you know, who was a businessman in here, in Minot. He had a herd of buffalo. And when Martin was working, they didn't get to town. All they did was work. So he got called out by Foxholm to help with this herd of buffalo. So they thought, well, man, this will be great. When we're done, we can go to Minot. Well, they were in a vehicle, and this one bull was kind of lagging back, so they started honking the horn and pushing this bull. Well, the bull turned around, hooked the pickup, put a horn through the radiator. That ruined their trip to Minot. They never did make it. So he loved to help young people. Martin was a wonderful role model for myself and many others growing up in Williston community. Martin gave his family a marvelous gift, and I've read the book. He created memories and stories and put it in a book called Stories of the Dakota Hovdes. I believe in my heart Martin is a perfect example of a North Dakota rancher. He told me he never got wealthy ranching. Many didn't at that time. But like a fella told me one time, he said, "I'd rather have a friend than a dollar any day." That was Martin. I don't believe Martin ever had an enemy. He was quiet, soft-spoken, and I don't think you'll find a better person. He would be a great inductee into the North Dakota Hall of Fame. Thanks.
I'm J.J. Hovde, and Martin was my grandpa. I had this nice speech written, and Ed took most of my material, so I just get to stand up and tell you some stories, which is even better. Grandpa was, I was out working cattle one day, and we were talking about Grandpa, and the place I was at, they didn't know him, and they said, "Well, I heard about your Grandpa Martin, but I never knew him. What was he like?" And the best way to describe him, I said, he was a grand old man. And he really was. He was one of the few people I've ever known, maybe the only one. I never heard him say a bad word about anyone. And that's a rare trait. It's a rare trait now, and it was rare then, I'm sure too. But one of my favorite stories, just to kind of tell you what a good hand he was and a good cowboy. It's fitting that we're right here when I tell this story, because this happened just west of here in Sanish. Grandpa wanted to raise some. He had kids coming up, so he wanted to raise some smaller, better horses. And he heard about a man in Sanish who had some smaller horses, and they said they were pretty good. So one day he got up early, headed out, rode all the way to Sanish from southeast of Williston. I suppose that's about a 70-some mile trip. Came here, looked at the horses, bought 3 broodmares and a stud, spent the night, got up early the next morning, and started out trailing his new horses home. Of course, none of them were halter broke, and of course the stud, as soon as he started taking them away from this country, he wanted to stay in on his home place. So the stud was up there herding those 3 broodmares back to him. Well, before long, his saddle horse, of course, was wore out. So here he sits, you're not going to call anybody for help. You're not going to go home and get the pickup and trailer. So he roped the stud, tied him down, took the saddle off his horse, and somehow got that saddle wiggled underneath that stud, got his bridle off his horse, and when he let that stud up, he was on him. So, of course, he turned the saddle horse loose. The saddle horse, he knew where to go, so he just headed home, and then Dad rode that unhalter broke stud all the way from Sanish back to southeast of Williston. So when he got there, he told me that story one day, and that was a funny thing about Grandpa. He didn't tell that story to brag about himself. It was just a story that he told him. But he said, "Well, when I got home, I had 3 pretty nice little broodmares, and I had a broke stud." So another one of my memories, Ed had mentioned the Clarence Parker Ranch, which is the ranch that Dad ranches on. Grandpa worked that when he was a young man, and so up on the hill when we first got there were still the old corrals, which Grandpa helped build, as a young man, and we still used them. And but we had some colts to start, and so we were up on that hill, and Dad and I were up there, and there was a little round pen there made out of these old rails that they'd cut down on the river, and so we had these 3 colts saddled, and we were working them. We're going to ride them. That was our first ride, and sure enough, Grandpa shows up. So before you know it, we'd kind of coaxed Grandpa onto one of them, and I got on one of them, Dad got on one of them, and so the three of us put the first ride on those three colts that day, and that was a real special memory for me, and I know Grandpa was pretty proud too. It was kind of funny at the time though. You know, of course, Dad's always trying to give everybody advice about their horsemanship, but Grandpa wasn't taking any that day. He'd done that so many times that he just basically shoved us out of the way and crawled on his colt. He was ready to get on one again, and he would have been about 73 or 4 at that time. So that was a pretty good day. But to me, Grandpa Martin is really what the Cowboy Hall of Fame is all about. You know, he didn't make a name for himself in the rodeo arena or the show ring, but he lived an honorable life as a rancher and a cowboy, and he passed those values on to his children and to so many other children in the community. He really helped a lot of people out, especially with the rodeo and 4-H and just anything. He was just a great guy. So thank you.
I'm Dorvan Solberg, and I am proud to be a friend, have been a friend of Martin Hovde's. Martin was a cowboy. He was a cowman. He loved kids. He helped the young people at the fair and for their 4-H projects. And he was always there to help someone. Just a little short story. One day we were having a roundup and a branding at John's place. And John, of course, was obviously the boss that day, and he'd sent Martin and I and JJ out to gather some cattle in the Missouri breaks, and so he wanted us to bring this bull in. Well, this old bull, he was on the hook, and he was blowing snot, and he'd go hide in the brush, and then he'd come and get you. And so we finally just rode up on the hill, and here come the boss, John Hovde. He said, why don't you guys bring that bull in? And JJ said to him, why don't you bring him in yourself, Dad? But, yeah, Martin needs to be in the Hall of Fame.